The doll in my daughter's closet. My daughter found a porcelain doll in the wall of our house during a renovation, sealed behind a section of drywall so old and so carefully patched that our contractor said, when he found it, that whoever had put it there had gone to real trouble to make sure nobody would ever accidentally find it during a normal repair. I want to tell you before anything else that we should have thrown that doll away the moment we found it, and that the reason we didn't, the reason I let my 6-year-old daughter keep a porcelain doll that had been deliberately hidden inside a wall by someone who wanted it gone forever, is the single decision from this entire story that I regret more than any other, and the one I think about more than a year later, every single time I check on her while she's sleeping. My name is Melissa Okafor. My husband Ben and I bought an older craftsman-style house 2 years ago. A modest 3-bedroom that needed work but had good bones, and we spent our first year there, slowly renovating room by room, as our budget allowed, starting with the upstairs bathroom and eventually, in the spring of last year, moving on to our daughter Zuri's bedroom, which still had the original 1940s plaster walls and an outdated closet layout we wanted to modernize. Our contractor, a patient, methodical man named Frank who'd worked on plenty of old houses over his career, found the doll while opening up a section of wall between Zuri's closet and what had originally been, based on the house's old blueprints, a much smaller adjoining space, possibly a linen closet, possibly something else entirely, sealed off at some point in the house's history, and simply absorbed into the current closet's dimensions without leaving any obvious trace from the outside. The doll was wrapped in a piece of yellowed muslin cloth, tucked into a small cavity in the wall that had clearly been built for exactly that purpose. Not a random gap left by construction, but a deliberate, finished recess, framed and sealed with the same care as any other part of the house, suggesting whoever had placed the doll there had wanted it hidden permanently and professionally, rather than simply thrown away or forgotten. "You don't usually see this," Frank told us, holding the wrapped bundle with a kind of careful hesitation that I noticed at the time and dismissed as simple professional caution around an old, fragile object. Old houses sometimes have stuff sealed into walls, newspapers, tools, sometimes a shoe. There's an old superstition about walling up a shoe for good luck, but this was built specific. Somebody wanted this hidden, not just out of the way. Zuri, 6 years old at the time, and delighted by the discovery in the way only a 6-year-old can be delighted, by finding a hidden treasure in her own bedroom wall, asked immediately if she could keep it. And I want to be honest that neither Ben nor I saw any reason to say no. The doll itself, once unwrapped, was beautiful in an old-fashioned way. Porcelain face and hands, a dress made of faded but still intact blue fabric, glass eyes that had a slightly unsettling quality up close, the way antique dolls often do, but nothing that struck either of us in that moment as anything beyond an interesting, slightly eerie piece of the house's history. I want to walk you through the months that followed, because the escalation, as it always seems to be in these situations, was slow enough at the start that we explained away each individual incident long before we were willing to consider what they added up to. The first thing I noticed, within a few weeks of the doll taking up residence on Zuri's shelf, was that she'd started insisting the doll needed to face a specific direction at all times. Toward the window, she said, so she can see outside, and would become distressed, disproportionately so for what seemed like a minor detail, if Ben or I moved the doll while cleaning her room and failed to reposition it exactly the way she wanted. I filed this under ordinary childhood particularity, the kind of specific, arbitrary rule kids attached to favorite toys all the time, and didn't think much more of it. The second thing was harder to dismiss so easily. About 6 weeks after the doll came into our house, I started noticing that it had moved on its own multiple times, always in small specific ways. Turned slightly from the position Zuri or I had left it in. Moved a few inches along the shelf. Once found on the floor beneath the shelf, despite there being no obvious reason for it to have fallen. I asked Zuri each time whether she'd moved it, and each time she told me no, in the specific, unbothered tone kids use when they're telling the truth about something that doesn't concern them. More interested in whatever she was actually doing at the time than in a doll's exact position on a shelf. I began, without fully admitting to myself why, testing this. I started marking the doll's position with small pieces of tape on the shelf before I left Zuri's room each night, checking in the morning to see whether it had moved. Over the following 2 weeks, it moved 4 separate times, always at night, always by small but measurable distances, and always without exception, ending up facing more directly toward Zuri's bed, rather than the window she'd originally insisted it needed to face. I told Ben about this, expecting him to offer some reasonable explanation, involving drafts, an uneven shelf, our old house settling in ways that might, over time, shift a light object's position slightly. He tried, at first, to offer exactly that kind of explanation. And then, about a week later, he came to me with his own account of something he'd witnessed directly, which he'd apparently been sitting on for several days, unsure how to describe it, without sounding like he'd lost his grip on reality. I checked on Zuri around midnight 2 nights ago, he said. She was asleep. The doll was in the position you'd marked, facing the window, same as always. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just making sure she was okay. And when I looked back at the shelf before I left, the doll had turned. I watched it turn. Melissa. Not fast, not like it moved suddenly. Slow, like something you'd barely notice happening if you weren't already looking right at it. It's facing her bed now instead of the window, and I have not been able to convince myself I imagine that, no matter how many times I've tried. I want to describe what happened over the following month, because it's the part of this story that finally forced us to act, even though acting, in this case, turned out to be far more complicated and far less effective than either of us expected going in. Zuri began talking about the doll, the way children talk about an imaginary friend, except with a specificity and consistency that felt different from the usual, loosely defined imaginary companions kids invent and abandon within weeks. She called the doll Constance, a name she insisted the doll had told her, rather than one she'd invented herself, and a detail that unsettled me considerably once I finally worked up the nerve to do some research into the doll's possible origins and found, through old county property records, that the family who'd owned our house from 1938 until 1961 had included a daughter, born in 1941, whose name, according to a single surviving census record, was Constance. Constance, according to the same records, appeared on the 1950 census as a 9-year-old living in that house. She did not appear on any subsequent record I could find. No death certificate, no marriage record, no further mention in any document I had access to. Simply a 9-year-old girl who existed clearly in one census and vanished from every subsequent official trace of her family's life, as though she had simply stopped being recorded the moment she turned 10. I called the County Historical Society, and a volunteer researcher there, after several days of her own, digging through records I didn't have access to, found one further document that unsettled me more than anything else in this entire investigation. A brief item from a 1951 edition of the local paper, reporting that a 9-year-old girl in our neighborhood had gone missing, presumed to have wandered off and drowned in a nearby creek. Her body never recovered. The search called off after several weeks, with the case officially closed as an accidental death with no further investigation. The article did not name the family, protecting their privacy in a way common to reporting from that era. But the timing, the age, and the neighborhood matched closely enough that I no longer had any reasonable doubt about who our daughter's new imaginary friend actually was.
I want to describe one more incident from that period. Before I get to the night, everything came to a head because it involved someone outside our immediate family and gave us for the first time outside confirmation that we weren't simply
Imagining or misinterpreting an ordinary if strange attachment our daughter had formed to an old toy. Zuri had a close friend from school, a girl named Poppy, who came over for a sleepover about 2 months into this whole situation, before Ben and I fully understood what we were actually dealing with. I want to be honest that we hadn't thought to mention anything about the doll to Poppy's parents beforehand, since at that point we still hoped against a growing pile of evidence that everything happening was simply an unusually persistent phase our daughter was going through. Poppy went home the next morning quieter than she'd arrived, and her mother called me that same afternoon in a careful, hesitant tone that I recognized immediately, having used something close to it myself in conversations about this exact subject. Poppy had apparently woken in the night, in the guest air mattress set up in Zuri's room, to find both girls' eyes open in the dark, her own and, disturbingly, Zuri's as well. Though Zuri showed no memory of being awake at all the next morning, and had heard, in the quiet of that room, a second child's voice, distinct from Zuri's, join in what had apparently become a three-way conversation Poppy hadn't consented to and didn't understand. She said the other girl kept asking if Poppy wanted to stay too, her mother told me, and Poppy said something about the doll's eyes moving on their own to follow her around the room, and I know how that sounds, I really do. But she was so shaken this morning, and she's not really the kind of kid who makes up stories like that for attention. I just wanted to ask you, is there something going on in your house that Poppy might have seen that scared her? I didn't know how to answer that question honestly, without sounding, to a parent I barely knew, like someone in the grip of a genuine delusion. So I gave her a vague, apologetic answer about an old family heirloom that might have looked strange in the dark, and I made sure quietly that we never scheduled another sleepover at our house for the remainder of that school year, unwilling to risk exposing another child to whatever was actually happening in Zuri's room at night. Zuri began sleeping poorly around the same time I finished this research, waking in the night to talk, apparently, with Constance, conversations Ben and I would sometimes catch fragments of through her closed bedroom door, one-sided from our perspective, our daughter's voice asking questions and pausing, as though listening to answers we couldn't hear, in a cadence too consistent, too much like an actual back-and-forth conversation, too easily dismiss as ordinary sleep-talking. She just wants to stay with someone who can see her, Zuri told me one morning, when I finally asked her directly what she and Constance talked about at night. She got left behind a long time ago. She doesn't want to be alone in the wall anymore.
I want to describe the night. Everything came to a head because it's the reason we no longer have that doll in our house, and it's the reason I still, more than a year later, cannot fully explain what actually happened without sounding, even to my own ears, like I'm describing something that couldn't possibly be real.
I woke around 2 in the morning to the sound of Zuri's bedroom door opening and found her standing in the hallway, fully awake, holding the doll against her chest, looking at me with an expression that was entirely her own. Not the flat, absent look I'd read about in other people's accounts of possession or trance states. Just my daughter, scared, 6 years old, holding a doll too tightly. Constance says we have to let her stay forever now, Zuri said. She says if I put her back in the wall, she'll be really sad, and she doesn't want to be sad anymore. She wants to sleep in my bed instead. I took the doll from Zuri, as gently as I could manage, given how tightly she'd been holding it, and I felt, the moment my hands closed around that cold porcelain, a specific, mounting wrongness that I can only describe as similar to picking up something that should have had significantly more weight than it did, or significantly less, some mismatch between what my hands expected and what they actually received that unsettled me on a level well below conscious thought. Ben and I decided together that same night that the doll needed to leave our house permanently, regardless of how Zuri felt about it. And I want to be honest that the process of actually getting rid of it was far more difficult than simply deciding to do it. We tried first the straightforward option, wrapping it back in its original muslin cloth and putting it directly into an outdoor trash bin, only to find it sitting, unwrapped, back on Zuri's shelf the following morning, in the exact position Zuri had originally insisted it needed to be, facing the window, not her bed, as though it had briefly, deliberately, returned to its earliest, least alarming posture specifically to reassure us that nothing was wrong.
We tried again, more deliberately this time, driving it to a donation center in a different town entirely, dropping it into a collection bin marked for children's toys. And I want you to understand how carefully we thought this through, how confident we felt, driving home that afternoon, that we'd finally solved the problem through simple, physical distance. Zuri found the doll in her closet again, 3 days later, and neither Ben nor I have ever been able to explain, in any way that satisfies either of us, how an object we personally watched drop into a donation bin 40 minutes from our house ended up back inside a closet. We kept locked in a room neither of us had left open at any point during those 3 days. We eventually consulted a woman recommended to us by a friend of a friend, someone who specialized, according to her modest, carefully worded website, in helping families navigate unusual attachments in the home, and who came to our house, examined the doll with a seriousness that made both Ben and me feel, for the first time in weeks, like we were finally being taken as seriously as the situation deserved, and told us something that has shaped how I think about this entire experience ever since.
"This isn't really about the doll," she said. "The doll is just the shape it found to travel in. What you're dealing with is a very lonely, very old presence that attached itself to your daughter because she's the first person in a very long time who was kind enough and open enough to actually listen. Simply discarding the object won't work because the object was never really the point. It's a vessel, not a source. What you need to do is help your daughter understand, gently,
In a way she can actually process at her age, that being kind to something doesn't obligate her to let it stay forever, and that it's all right to say goodbye to something even when saying goodbye feels sad. I want to include one more piece of this story that I only learned after that consultation, because it reframed for me exactly why the doll had been sealed in that wall in the first place, rather than simply discarded.
And it came unexpectedly from Frank, our contractor, who called me several weeks after finishing the renovation to ask, somewhat awkwardly, whether everything had been all right since he'd found that cavity in the wall. I told him a carefully abbreviated version of what had happened, enough to explain why I was asking, and he went quiet for a long moment before telling me something he said he'd debated mentioning at the time and had ultimately decided against, not wanting to alarm us over what he'd assumed was probably nothing. "When I opened that wall," he said, "before I found the doll itself, I found a little bit of writing, scratched into the back of the drywall panel that had sealed the cavity, right where nobody would ever see it once the wall was patched over again. I didn't think much of it. Figured it was just some old graffiti from whoever built the addition. But it said, as close as I can remember it, 'She won't stop asking. Better this way for everyone.' I didn't mention it because I didn't want you thinking your new house came with some kind of curse attached, and honestly, I still feel a little foolish even bringing it up now. But given what you're telling me happened, I thought you should probably know. I think about that scratched message more than almost anything else in this entire story, because it suggests something my own research into census records could never fully confirm on its own. That whoever sealed that doll into the wall understood, with total certainty, exactly what they were dealing with, and made a deliberate, considered choice, better this way for everyone, to contain rather than confront it, the same choice, in its own way, that Ben and I eventually made ourselves. Once the counselor helped us understand, we couldn't simply discard the problem, and needed instead to give it a real, deliberate ending. We worked with Zuri over the following weeks carefully without frightening her, on the idea that Constance deserved to finally rest, that holding on to her out of guilt or fear of upsetting her wasn't actually kindness, and that saying a real, deliberate goodbye, rather than simply trying to throw the doll away as though it were ordinary garbage, was the only way to help her the way she actually needed. We held a small, quiet ceremony in our backyard, at Zuri's insistence, burying the doll properly this time, rather than discarding it, with Zuri saying, in her own 6-year-old words, a version of goodbye that the counselor had helped her think through in advance. The doll has not returned since. Zuri stopped mentioning Constance within about a month of that ceremony, and I've made a careful point of never bringing the subject up first, letting whatever resolution we found settle into the kind of quiet, unexamined peace that I think, honestly, our whole family needs in order to keep living in that house at all. I think about Constance sometimes late at night, the same 9-year-old girl whose name appeared on a single census record and then simply stopped existing in any official trace afterward, sealed inside a wall by a family who, I assume, understood something about what had happened to her that made them choose to hide the doll rather than simply throw it away. The way we eventually learned we couldn't do either. I don't know what happened to that family, or why they chose concealment over disposal, though I have my own theory, born mostly of guilt and speculation, rather than any evidence I could actually point to. I think they tried to throw it away first, the same way we did, and found the same way we found. That it kept coming back, and I think eventually, exhausted and frightened in ways I now understand far too well, they simply gave up trying to get rid of it at all, and settled instead for sealing it somewhere they hoped no one would ever find, hoping that hiding it well enough would be the closest thing to solving the problem that they'd ever manage. If you're ever renovating an old house and you find something sealed deliberately into a wall, a doll, a box, anything wrapped and hidden with more care than simple disposal would require, I would ask you to consider, before you let your own children claim it as an exciting discovery, why someone went to that much trouble to make sure it stayed hidden in the first place. Some things aren't lost. They're buried on purpose, by people who understood something about them that took the rest of us considerably longer and considerably more fear to finally learn for ourselves.